Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here with another conversation episode. Now, I'm going to be honest, in my height of podcasting, I would want to just make sure I'm highlighting, the important issues going on right now, but quite frankly, there are so many, and I'm so burnt out and exhausted and scared that I'm not going to try. But anyway, the world is a tough place right now, and I think we all need a little levity in the form of learning about the history of Western imperialism. So today I am back with the wonderful women of the Partial Historians, one of the Memory Collective podcasts, and my favorite two people to explain Roman history to me so that I don't have to learn Roman history myself. And today we are talking about the idea of Roman triumphs and how they often eventually resulted in triumphal arches, and what that looks like, what it's about. There's a lot of history behind Western imperialism and the way it celebrates that imperialism, what that looks like, what it means. And so we had, it's both entertaining and also very timely and relevant. If there was ever a time to just keep learning this 2,000 years of Western imperialism, it's now. So, enjoy. Conversations. Celebrating imperial violence, the history of Roman triumphs and triumphal arches with the Partial Historians.
I'm excited that you guys are already finding this topic to be fun. Because I just feel like it's something Michaela and I have been talking about it for a while, just because I think I had the idea of, like, as soon as Trump started talking about building an arch, and I thought, okay, well, maybe we need to talk about the history of that, but it just kind of keeps getting more and more relevant, I suppose. This idea of, like, a triumphal arch, and what does that do? But then, of course, in Rome, it's connected to the triumphs, and now I'm just rambling. But I can thank you for one, maybe, is the first thing, and then I'm going to pause. Oh my gosh.
Well, we're really excited to talk about the Roman triumph. I mean, this is where it all began, because triumphal arches become part of the Roman triumph, but they're not initially what the triumph is really about, nor is it an expression of the triumph. And even when we get into later periods of history beyond Rome, there's a visual emulation, but the ideas associated with arches, even if they're called triumphal arches, tends to be quite diverse. So this is a really interesting topic to get into.
Great. So it's even more valid or widespread than, I don't even know what words I'm saying. I'm going to turn my brain on today. It's just more relevant than I thought, I guess.
Yeah,
or just there's more to it.
Triumphal arches, which is the name that we give them, that idea in Latin doesn't come around until a little bit later in terms of the actual naming of it, like quite late in Rome's history. And because we do tend to refer to them that way, you would automatically assume that they were built to go along with the ceremony and the parade and all of that kind of stuff. But they could be erected for other reasons. They are, like a lot of things in Rome's landscape, designed to evoke memories, to memorialize things, to commemorate things. And so some of the arches that people might have seen in their travels weren't necessarily ever part of an actual triumph and were erected for different reasons, which would connect with the idea that you were thinking about in terms of what's happening in modern day America. It's not necessarily something that's going to be part of a triumph, one would hope, but it is being erected for visual meaning and for commemorating something particular.
Yes. Yeah. Putting it very carefully. Jesus. I'm waiting for my brain to turn on. Okay, maybe we just like, can you guys tell me like the basics of a triumph, like the procession, maybe like how it started? Because I imagine it's something that they were doing for a long time and which like had varied forms, and including partially the arches, like you were saying.
Well, can I do an annoying historian answer and say yes and no?
Dr. Brad, just setting us up for challenges.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just start out with my understanding of the triumph, which is that although we have lots of evidence for them, actually, we do have visual representations, we obviously have written descriptions, and of course we do have some monuments that are associated with triumphs or represent the triumphs, etc. So you'd think we must know a lot about them because the Romans themselves obviously loved talking about the triumphs. At the same time, we're talking about 1,000 years of Roman history. Supposedly the triumph was part of all of that, although some people might question that. But in spite of the fact that we do have a lot of evidence and the Romans love talking about them, not all the details match up, and we actually can't be certain exactly what happened. We have what historians might call a generalized, broad account of what we think happened during a Roman triumph, but we're also pretty certain that there was diversity over that 1,000 years in which there were probably about 300 triumphs held.
That's still a lot over 1,000 years, though.
It is, but a lot of them also are compacted into the Republican period. So even though Rome has this 1,000-year history, and we definitely see elements of the triumph continue on in the Imperial period, there is a real division between what we think we know about triumphs that happen before the career of Augustus really takes off and after Augustus. So there's kind of like two phases to triumphal history, even from a Roman perspective, because Augustus does this thing where he basically shuts it down.
I'm going to point out Augustus ruining the party for everyone again, Dr. G.
Him? That guy? He's so likable.
We're only 6 minutes in and I got to mention Augustus. We're doing pretty well. I mean, I feel like I'm really nailing it with the Augustus content. So we have this idea that stretches right back, as Dr. Rad said, right back to the early phases of Roman history. And we do get discussions of triumphs happening with the Roman kings. So even as far back as we could possibly go to this sort of mythical, legendary period of Rome's history, we do get mentions of things like triumphs. Romulus was supposed to have celebrated one, so he's the big standout. But then we also have the kings that we consider to be the Etruscan style kings, and apparently they bring in a bit of an Etruscan flavor to the whole triumph as well. This is where we get the really grand purple toga, where we get the wearing of the wreath as you do the procession. These sorts of details come into play under some of the later Roman kings, according to our narrative sources. But what makes a triumph? How does the procession change over time? Obviously, Rome gets bigger, so the route of the procession also changes. And then you've got moments where you get into the Republic and they want to keep the triumph. But because it's associated with kings up until that point, they have to find a way to desanitize it and make it, not desanitize, sanitize it. And make it appropriate.
What does that mean? Desanitize something.
Let's dirty this up.
Make it dirty.
This triumph is way too clean.
Instead of red face paint, I want you to go with mud.
Yeah. They try to make it more palatable to themselves because by putting one person on a pedestal for an entire day and having them parade around the city in very fancy clothing, it does make them stand out as maybe somebody putting their head above the parapet in a way that Republicans don't like. And so they bring in this mechanism to have the Senate approve a triumph. And this is where we get into the sort of finicky details of when would you be allowed to have one? Because you can't just presume as a Roman general that you will get one. You have to wait for the old guys to come out, have a chat to you, and be like, oh, yeah, I suppose you killed enough people. We'll let you have one.
I guess it's glorious enough, kind of, whatever.
So was it always like military then? It was always like because of some kind of military win?
Yes. I mean, the difficulty is, again, being annoying historians about this, we
Yeah.
can't actually be 100% certain what the purpose of a triumph was, which I know sounds ridiculous because you've got this guy who's a victorious general getting all dressed up in fancy clothing, painting his face red, jumping in a chariot, which may or may not have a phallus attached to it. I mean, it sends a pretty clear
Always.
message. But we actually aren't 100% certain what the purpose of this was. There have been various theories about what it involves in terms of, is it some sort of way of sort of cleansing this Roman army and this general as they are welcomed back inside the sacred boundary of the city? It does obviously seem to have quite strong connections to Jupiter, because one thing I can say, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that a triumph starts outside of the sacred boundary, outside of the Pomerium, and it ends up at the Temple of Jupiter. I know, radical development. That's about all I'm willing to say. I think that's about all of us can say for certain in terms of the exact route. But that obviously means that there's some sort of connection to Jupiter there. Some people have suggested it has something to do with Imperium. So Imperium being the right to command an army, and it therefore is something where only someone who holds Imperium can also have a triumph. They do also introduce this lesser version called an ovatio or an ovatio, if I'm getting my Latin correct, but it makes me sound too much like Elmer Fudd, so I'm not going to say that. That's a slightly lesser pared down version, and it's usually explained as being when the enemy you were fighting isn't seen as being quite on a par. It's not necessarily like a foreign foe that you've managed to triumph over. It's, when you're fighting pirates or you're fighting slaves. So Crassus, for example, most famously for me, gets one for facing down Spartacus in the slave war. But, he's done a good job, but they're slaves. So
yeah, they don't want to give them enough credit.
Yeah, exactly. Don't you
Yeah.
start thinking that is impressive enough? We can't glorify these slaves and their revolt. Yeah, so there's confusion around what exactly the Romans were doing with a triumph.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. So if we're talking about a triumph and an ovatio, the main difference is in a triumph, you get to ride in the chariot. Very exciting, which means somebody will stand behind you being like, remember that you are a man. And when it's the ovatio, you have to walk on your own feet. So super boring, very tedious.
And so you would be like inherently like with the crowd in a way that in a triumph you get to be really like above everyone.
Totally. So you have these moments where an ovatio is a lesser honor and everybody knows it, but people do still come out to celebrate, obviously, because you have done something spectacular. It's just not quite spectacular on the same level as something that would be triumph worthy.
So you were saying earlier that like you don't know, we can't say for certain. Obviously, also like we talk about this in mythology and in everything in this show so often that we can't know anything for certain. But you were saying we can't be like we don't know the purpose of them, and maybe it's ritual. But then obviously it also serves like a more like social purpose of like I mean, not I don't want to just straight dive into the word propaganda, but like the word propaganda, yes, but obviously more than that as well. So is it possible that it's just kind of like everything in one?
Yeah, look, I think it's one of those things where it's probably because the purpose of the triumph does evolve over Rome's history. And it probably means different things, obviously, to different people. The triumph is interesting because obviously it can mean something to you personally if you go to an event like this. I mean, these are huge, elaborate, expensive events in which the community does supposedly take part. There are sacrifices, there are feasts. The whole idea of the triumph is that you get to see a lot of things. So it is about the community. And one of the purposes that does get mentioned in our source material is the idea of bringing a foreign victory to Rome itself, because the triumph does seem to be linked to the city of Rome itself. Now, there are some interesting moments that occur outside of the city, but they don't seem to be looked at as truly valid triumphs. It does seem to be linked to the city of Rome itself, the idea of bringing what has happened elsewhere to the Roman people and bonding them together and being like, look at what you've accomplished. Look at the greatness of Rome. There does seem to be an element of that, and honoring, obviously, the general, honoring the army because they are a part of the triumph as well. There are those elements to it. There does seem to be those elements of sort of cleansing and purification in terms of the ritual aspects of the triumph. But for someone like Ovid, for example, he talks about the triumph as being a great place to pick up because there's so many people around and there are ladies potentially in the crowd.
Fucking would.
Yeah. What do you think of them slaves? Why don't we go back and chat about it over some woof nipple chips? And so there's that element. But also, if we go right back to the earliest period of Rome's history, which is something that Dr. G and I now know a lot about, we think that warfare in that time period was quite different to what it became later. So what we've been noticing, even though our sources come from mostly the late Republic and the Empire, and therefore the way that they relate Rome's military escapades is sometimes colored by their own experiences, there's enough evidence there to suggest that Rome in the early Republic was nowhere near as settled as later Romans would like you to believe. And there's certainly not a standing army as there is later on. It seems more like a situation where you've got elite war leaders who are using their clans and their clients and their connections to sometimes wage wars, which are kind of almost what you might call, I suppose, private wars. So, for example, a very famous example from the Republican period, the early Republican period, is the Fabian clan getting together and being like, yeah, we're going to go and fight some Etruscans. And it does seem to be almost outside of the state. It seems to be something that's being run by the Fabians. So it might also have something to do with the fact that you've got these war leaders who need to somehow be integrated into the community, or there's been some sort of agreement between them and a community, which once the conflict is over and what they've set out to accomplish has been achieved, it needs to now be kind of negotiated. They need to somehow finish off this arrangement, and there is a lot of movement, particularly for the elites. Rome most famously, obviously, is a place where people are supposedly welcomed in from various communities. In fact, pretty much all of the kings are foreigners. And we do get very famous families coming from elsewhere into Rome. So there is clearly movement going on. It seems to be almost more like a feudal kind of system in a way in early Roman history. And the early triumphs might have something to do with that early style of warfare. And it also could have something to do with the fact that it's a new way or an evolved way for the elites to compete with each other and show off their achievements rather than, say, having excessively fancy burials or whatever. It might be part of this language that Rome develops where it is about public display. And that shows itself not just in triumphs, but in things like buildings, which you dedicate to the community and build for the community and the gods and all of that. So it probably has to do with this very murky early Republican period, that there's a particular way that a triumph is, and then that evolves as Rome itself becomes more formalized, I suppose.
I think you can't discount the ritual aspect of all of this as well. So it's really early
sure.
on in the piece that we come to understand that you cannot achieve a triumph unless you had engaged in a just war. And this may have been a mechanism that was being used by the senatorial elite to perhaps rein in some of that warlord behavior that we see emerging.
Yeah.
And I
Not to
think
put too fine a point on it, but it feels to me like how in the States, Congress has to approve it and then it's okay for you to go to war. And yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
totally,
Mm.
totally. So you've got to have some sign off. So in the example of the Fabians, for instance, they kind of took it upon themselves to deal with the Etruscans. And it does feel like a privateer kind of situation because the Etruscans are neighbors to their personal family territory. And that doesn't go well for the Fabians, by the way. They have a terrible time. But they do try to persecute what appears to be a Fabian led war outside of broader Rome's jurisdiction. And that's the sort of thing that's not going to fly as the state becomes more formalized. And so the development of priesthoods like the feriales, who do go out, look at the situation, consider the signs that they read in the skies, make declarations of war to which they expect priests from the other locations to respond to. And then when they don't, inevitably, because other people do things differently and maybe they don't have their own feriales and maybe they weren't expecting some priests to turn up and ask them whether a war should take place, then the feriales turn around and say, yes, this is a just war that can be conducted, and that would mean that the generals involved with Imperium would be eligible for a triumph if they do the needful things. And these numbers get thrown around, and again, we cannot be sure because obviously early Rome is much more fragmented in its evidence than later periods of history, but they talk about a threshold of enemies killed as being about 5,000. Now, I don't know how you go
Wow.
around and reckon that on the battlefield
Yeah.
necessarily, and
That
how do
looks
you
about
make
5,000,
this?
give or take a few. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that pile of heads over there. 200.
It reminds me of Herodotus trying to say how many Persians came to Thermopylae, and he's like, there were 2 million. And it's like, that's physically impossible.
And only 10 Spartans. Oh my
Yeah.
god.
Oh, that's so amazing.
Yeah,
That's so
exactly.
interesting, though. So, like, they have a number of people that have to die
The
in
Romans
order
we're
for it to
talking
be, like,
about, yeah.
valid. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And there is a cleansing aspect to this as well, because even when you come in for the triumph, there are various sort of stops along the way of the procession. So, for instance, if you had captured an enemy leader and they were part of the triumph, you would stop at a certain point to drop them off to the local jail where they would then be executed. And that was part of the procession. And then you would move on to the temple to be cleansed and all of the good things. And then some other sacrifices would happen, which were very important to Jupiter because there's the transition point where the triumphator, the person celebrating the triumph, does remove the crown that they've received and it goes back onto the statue of Jupiter. So there's a sense in which the ritual is now complete and the sacrifices can happen and then the feast will inevitably occur. And that person returns into the citizen body and they no longer have this highfalutin position as momentarily the god Jupiter Optus Maximus.
So it's quite fleeting. It's just this little jaunt through town and then it's kind of over. I mean, I know it's more than that, but I want to call it
Just
that.
a little bit, yes. That is the idea. I mean, the
Yeah.
Romans obviously don't like this idea of anyone being too far above themselves. It's a weird thing to understand about the Romans because obviously when we get into the Republic particularly, the nature of that system is so competitive and it is about individuals representing their families competing for power, and we see that obviously come apart in spectacular fashion in the late Republic, where we start getting people who are sort of overmighty, and the Romans don't like that. But at the same time, at the same time, they do want to honor people who have, done something for the community as well. So it is a weird balance, but I think it's just the way of Romans having that checks and balances sort of system where it is a temporary thing. In a way, I understand the Romans in this, because Dr. G and I, coming from Australia, there's a really strong thing here called the tall poppy syndrome, which is where Australians are insanely proud of Australians who succeed, particularly internationally, but at the same time, we cannot stand for people to become too arrogant or too above themselves, and we tend to tear people down if they're seen as being too arrogant. I feel like the Romans have that as well, and that they're like, yeah, compete, succeed, excel, conquer. But don't you go being arrogant about it, man. Don't you start thinking that you're better than you are.
Yeah, you got to do it the right way. No, that's
Yeah, but I think Dr. G is
Yeah.
right in terms of the ritual aspect of this. No matter what you do in terms of the triumph, or exactly what route it took, it always ends in a sacrifice. And you can't ignore, therefore, the ritualistic aspects of it. There's also the economic side to it. Perhaps not as much in the early Republic, even though the Romans like to pretend that they are conquering in glory all these peoples and having this amazing time. It's pretty clear that it's just local raiding that's mostly going on. But particularly once you get into the more certain historical period, when they are actually conquering nations, including Greece, sorry about it, they are bringing back booty, quite significant booty, and that booty is going to go into the community in one way or another. So it is also about bringing in wealth. It is actually even explicitly connected in some of our sources to the bringing in of extravagance to Rome. Another thing where the Romans are like, ooh, I do love to wear silk and have fancy cushions and exotic foods, but at the same time, oh my God, it's corrupting my purity. Oh, the simplistic rural life that made me what I am. How am I going to reconcile these two things? I'm going to cry into my silk handkerchief about it.
Yeah, look, the Romans are having a tough time. It's such a juggling act for them. They like to think of themselves as the rugged farmer. You might think of it or compare it to the idea of like the frontiersman, and that sort of, we can survive in any situation and we do it tough. But there is a point where that narrative doesn't fly with the actual life in the center, which is very opulent. There is obviously a grain dole to support anybody who needs it, and all of these sort of systems in place to ensure that people are not suffering, and they really have to talk themselves into their idea of the sort of the farmer. So I was thinking about the triumph as well, because obviously thinking about archers, like where do archers even come into this? And it's a good question, because again, we're not really sure on some level, but we think that initially there is a gate that they enter the city in, which makes sense because, as Dr. Rad was saying, they start outside the sacred boundary of Rome, this idea of the pomerium, where you cannot hold imperium inside the sacred boundaries of the city. So in order to be awarded a triumph, a general would have to stay outside of those sacred boundaries, wait for the Senate to come out and determine that a triumph was possible, and then they're able to conduct that triumph. And then they have to enter through a gate. And that gate is called the Porta Triumphalis. So the gate of the triumph. And you're like, all right, the Romans and their great naming systems. They're like, it's very logical. You're on the
straightforward.
Yeah. Come enter this gate. This is the start of the triumph, everybody. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that seems to be the beginning of it. A very sort of nondescript kind of system for having to pass through a gate, because there is a sacral boundary that must be crossed. And obviously the city wouldn't ever leave itself on defense without a defense system. So it has to be a gate, so you have to be able to close it. That seems to be the start of things. But this idea then starts to evolve into what we see as really highly ceremonial arch structures that begin to be built along the processional way. And that's, I think, a really interesting development. That takes a long time to happen.
So, okay. I mean, I don't want to jump us ahead, but also, or I rather, I mean, I'm interested in the arches, but also you said earlier, Peta, I think, that that they were all about like having a lot to see. And then so now I'm just so what are some of the like, I mean, obviously like it was the person, on the chariot and everything, but I imagine it's the Romans. They also did some wild shit. And even as you were saying that, I was thinking like, oh, did I hear that like Boudica was brought through in a triumph? Like, what are some maybe stories of the wackiest and darkest shit that the Romans brought through in a triumph?
Ooh, it gets
Ooh.
dark.
I'm
the
willing
things
to
we could
bet.
bring in. Wow.
Yeah. If you thought parades couldn't be dark, Rome is the place to have that view overturn. You want to have someone strangled in the parade? This is where you come. Yeah.
Yeah. Want to see people die along the procession? Come to us.
Yeah.
Obviously, Dr. Rat had mentioned the booty. So the gold, the silver, all the fancy stuff. One of the things that we don't know a lot about, because it's only mentioned in the written sources and the physical evidence for this doesn't survive, but it seems like maybe Rome had war artists, people who painted scenes of what had happened at particular battles, because there are a lot of pictures that are part of the triumph as well. So they talk about this whole category of triumphal paintings, and you're like, what
Oh,
is that? And none of them survive.
yeah.
May I
And so
mention my
that's,
favorite one?
yeah.
My favorite one, of course, is Cleopatra. So when
Mm.
Octavian wins the civil war between himself, Antony, well, actually, sorry, I won't misrepresent his intentions, Dr. G. Let me backtrack. When Octavian wins the war against Cleopatra, also against
Thank
Mark
you.
Antony, when he wins that war, we can't 100% be sure what actually happened to Cleopatra and how and why she died. There are obviously big problems with the accounts that are presented to us, and there are different versions of things. However,
You mean she didn't kill herself by snake?
yeah, I know. In the breast, of course, because that's where you do. You want to strip off, get topless, and then let the snake
Yeah.
bite you.
Tits out.
Yeah.
Do not ruin
Mhm.
history like this. Obviously, that's what happened.
Yeah, so one of the things that gets mentioned is that Cleopatra kills herself somehow because she doesn't want to be part of Octavian's triumph. She doesn't want to be taken in front of the Roman people, perhaps in chains, even golden chains. No, thank you. And so she kills herself because she doesn't want that to be the place where she ends up. And so, as a result, Octavian in his triumph has a picture of her, which does not survive, to represent her, because, of course, it's hugely glorious that he has conquered Cleopatra, particularly with the massive propaganda war that he'd been waging against her and Antony all this time. It's such a victory. And also, it's not just, oh, I've beaten Cleopatra. It's also, and Egypt is now mine, and the wealth of Egypt is now ours. It's that. So to have that representation, I mean, you need it. You need that placeholder so that the Roman people are reminded of what Octavian has actually accomplished here.
Yeah. So do we have any description of the painting, or we just know that there was a painting of Cleopatra?
Not really. I don't think so. No, I think we just hear that it is an image of her. Yeah.
It's just rude.
Although,
I just wish they described things better.
yeah, like
I know.
don't
I mean,
leave us hanging.
that would finally solve the mystery. Like, what did she look like?
Like, I get it. You
She
couldn't
had
preserve
hair
everything for us, but you could have written it down.
I also wonder, part of me wonders if Roman generals would they also bring dead bodies? And it's interesting that they don't. And I wonder if that's about the sacral boundaries of the city as well, because if Cleopatra dies in Egypt, fine, but there's no reason why you might not also bring the body back. But he doesn't. And I wonder if that's to do with Roman understanding of bodies and decomposition and
Yeah.
appropriateness.
I was gonna say, I wonder if it's just a hygiene thing. Yeah.
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 Like bring a body on a boat, on a ship at the least. That feels like even too far for the Romans.
First, we're going to mummify her. Then I'm going to bring her back.
Wasn't there an example of a triumph held for Trajan where Trajan had died by the time the triumph happened, and so they used a dummy instead?
Really? Wow. I did not know that. That's
Look, I could
amazing.
be wrong. Hang on 1 second. I will just check my notes, but I feel like that did happen.
I would like to hear about a
Trajan.
zombie triumph because that's what that sounds like.
The triumph in 117 to 118 BCE, Trajan's triumph over the
Wow.
Parthians, he was dead, so they put a dummy in instead.
Amazing. Find the best statue of Trajan that you can. We're just going to dress him up and do it anyway.
Yeah. That's a little different to what you're talking about, though, because that's him, not the enemies. He's the general, not the...
I think
Still
this suggests
fun.
something about the way the triumph is changing, though, under the imperial system,
Yes.
where it is less about the individual at that point and more about what does this tell us about Rome for people in
Right.
Rome. So it kind of doesn't matter that Trajan is gone, that conquest has happened, and it needs to be celebrated because those things need to go into the public treasury. And it's obviously a good look, I assume, for Hadrian to do that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, this is
Yeah.
where we have to remind ourselves of sometimes just how much wealth we're talking about flooding into Rome. One of the triumphal arches that people have probably seen is, of course, the Arch of Titus, which also has scenes from his triumph included in the triumphal arch itself.
like
So it's
meta.
a pretty important source, yeah, as well as being an example that most people have probably seen because of its location in Rome itself, obviously. But the money that comes into Rome as a result of that conquest goes into building things like the Colosseum, which is gigantic, obviously. I mean, you have to appreciate just how much money's coming in. And so it's not just the triumphal arch that commemorates the victory. It's also what they get to build with the money that comes in from those conquests. That also, I think, becomes part of the Roman landscape and therefore probably the Roman memory.
And if we're thinking about these actual arches that we still have in Rome today, so we've got the Arch of Titus. So that was made by Domitian to commemorate what had happened with Titus and also Vespasian, but Titus gets to claim it. And that arch is on the downhill stretch from the Palatine as you head back towards the Colosseum.
Okay.
And then you have the Arch of Septimius Severus, which is from 203, and that's in the Forum itself. And that one's got the big arch in the middle and two little arches next to it, all part of the same structure. And that one is pretty impressive because it's got imagery of Caracalla and Geta, but then Caracalla wins and kills Geta, and so then Geta gets chopped off that arch. So you can see the spots where he's ordered, being like, ruin it for me, leave only me. And then we have the really huge arch of Constantine, which is the one just outside the Colosseum. And that one is really quite interesting because that is an arch associated with a civil war, which is something that from a Roman perspective, that would never fly in the Republican period. You don't get to celebrate triumphs for overcoming other Romans. And even the one that Octavian celebrates over Cleopatra in Egypt is sketchy because Mark Antony is involved and he has to do a lot of not imperial yet, a lot of...
It's the devil woman. It's all her fault.
He's got to do a lot of work to make that not a civil war situation, but a conquest of Egypt situation to make it triumph eligible.
I see what you mean. Okay, right. So that's why it was contentious when you mentioned Mark Antony earlier, because
Yes,
it was not a civil war, despite it being
no.
against another Roman.
No, he's very careful to declare war. Yeah, no, he's very careful that he declares war against Egypt and Queen Cleopatra. Mark Antony just happens to be there. Whatever.
Mark Antony just chose the wrong country to be in. It's not
Yeah.
Octavian's fault.
Bad luck.
Location. Yeah.
But certainly with the Arch of Constantine, this one dates from the early 4th century, and it is a civil war. So the conceptualization of how you can celebrate a triumph and what a triumphal arch might also represent has clearly shifted over the centuries, because this is for his victory over Maxentius in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which is a hugely famous moment for Constantine anyway, in terms of like our later understanding of history. But that arch is massive, takes up heaps of space, but for a Republican Roman, that would have been the weirdest structure to exist, and it would have been in violation of all of their ideas about their self-definition.
The rules, Dr. G, the rules. Where's the rule book?
Yeah, why doesn't anybody care about doing things properly anymore?
But that's such a good example of like the time difference, right? The centuries that go into this history. And I mean, it's obviously something I talk about when it comes to mythology all the time, because there are like varying, you know, stories and all of this across the same similar 1,000 years of Greek history. And so, yeah, it's interesting to have the example of Constantine, who also obviously like kind of bookends the, you know, sort of ancient Roman period in that way. And then to have him like build that biggest one that would be like so against the rules of the Republic. Like that's just quite interesting historically as like a kind of full circle moment.
Yeah, he breaks Rome in more ways than one.
Yeah, and also one thing that we haven't mentioned, we've talked about the fact that the triumph itself is really meant to be tied very much to the city of Rome itself. So to the point where if there was a triumph happening, people might travel to Rome to see it because it's a spectacle. However, you can have triumphal arches outside of Rome. You find them throughout the empire because they're not just for triumphs. They're not just for triumphs. They're there to commemorate, to memorialize, etc., etc. I mean, you can probably tell from what Dr. G just said, the Arch of Titus is not built by Titus. So it's that thing of who wants to commemorate how are they going to do that? And so you can find triumphal arches elsewhere. So if you were thinking to yourself while you listen to us, but hang on just a goddamn minute, I've been outside of Italy and I've seen triumphal arches elsewhere. Yes, you probably have.
Yes, even ancient ones. So Septimius Severus was quite famous for making arches in other places. He put one up in Leptis Magna, where he was originally from. And so we get this sense that it is possible. That is in North Africa.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. The idea of the arch as a commemoration, that is an idea that gets cemented in the Roman imperial imagination in terms of the physicality of empire. So people in other places who may have seen depictions or had gone to Rome themselves, all of a sudden are like, oh, I could build something like that to commemorate what's it. And it then becomes completely detached from this idea of the Roman triumph itself, which, as Dr. Rad has emphasized, the triumph, the procession, is only for Rome. Yeah. You don't get to do one somewhere else. If you do one somewhere else, it's really weird and nobody would respect that. But the arch, well, I could build an arch and I could be anywhere. And if I'm in the
fanciest doorway anyone's ever seen.
Yeah, I could build one of those. And I think that flows in really nicely to what we see cropping up with modern triumphal arches, because there's heaps of them. And they sort of start to appear in like the 17th century and have continued to appear since in all sorts of locations for all sorts of reasons, none of which Romans would necessarily recognize as something to do with them. Although a lot of them are modeled, particularly on the Arch of Titus. That one seems to be particularly famous in terms of what it depicts and how it depicts it, and is one that people tend to copy in terms of style.
Yeah, the Arc de Triomphe is modeled on the Arch of Titus. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to say that's the only one I can name outside of Italy. So,
don't be like that. I've done some research. What about the Prince's Gate in Toronto?
Where is the Prince's Gate? Now I gotta look it up.
Yeah,
I'm willing to bet it's like blocks from where I live, and I'm gonna be like, oh,
I'm walking in the wrong direction all this time. Yeah, Canada definitely has an arch. It was built for an exhibition.
Oh, it's an exhibition place. Oh, I've seen that. Of course. No. I mean, it's not far from where I live, and I've definitely seen it. Most recently, I did go there for medieval times.
Uh-huh.
So,
nice.
No, that's
Well, I think the one
great.
thing-
Well, there we go. There's one in Toronto.
Yeah. Putting you on the Triumphal Arch map.
yeah, that's right. The one thing I think that does connect the Roman world with the modern world in terms of what we're doing with these things is that the concept of memory, I think, is very much tied to these sorts of monuments, as they are to most things that people erect in a public space for public facing reasons, whether you're talking about statues or fancy buildings. It's a similar thing. But I think it is interesting for Roman historians in particular because the Romans are particularly obsessed with memory, I think. You know, when the way they write their history, they write in terms of exemplar, you know, the people who have gone before, the people you should emulate, and the people who set a terrible example that you should avoid, and what makes you truly Roman. And they're interesting to look at. That's what Dr. G and I spend most of our time looking at. But we have to remember, obviously, that most Romans aren't reading fancy poetry or reading long histories. And so for your average Roman, the landscape, the city that they live in, these buildings, these monuments, that is part of their collective memory. It might be seeing a particular arch that was erected at a particular time that might evoke memories of when Rome conquered X, or it might be when you were part of a triumphal celebration that was particularly memorable to you. And one thing that I actually wasn't aware of until I was preparing for this episode is that memoria and monumenta, so memory and monuments, actually derive from the same root in Latin, coming from, and also the idea of manere, or to remind. So you can kind of see how
so it's Greek
important
too.
memory is. Yeah, and it actually, I thought that was
Yeah.
interesting for us because it obviously connects to the goddess Moneta, who is the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess after which our podcast network is named. And I'm not going to say the name because I can't.
So similar though. It's so similar,
Yeah,
like
so-
because Ndeme is like a short form of, and it's Mnemosyne. I do the silent M, but I've been trying to get it on silent. But yeah, that's so interesting because it's the like I love when I hear a Latin word that I'm like, oh, that's from Greek.
Yeah, well, I
Well,
think
there's
it's
a
just
lot
that
of
idea
crossover.
of the memory that they are creating, of creating a sort of collective memory and a collective identity, which is obviously still what erecting statues and buildings, etc., are about in our modern times. And for your average Roman, it would be things like statues, it would be artworks, it would be buildings, it would be monuments, it would be coins, it would be those visual things which they interact with every day, including things like when Augustus set up his little gallery of heroes. They were all dressed in, a lot of them were dressed in like triumphal garb. So, you know, the triumph is part of the visual landscape of Rome itself in more ways than the arches. And also Romans, of course, famously, supposedly had the practice of like the damning of the memory, the damnatio memoriae, which Dr. G alluded to when she was talking about Caracalla and Geta of Gladiator 2 fame.
Yeah.
Something that was, you know, proclaimed against people like Agrippina the Younger, you know. So memory is important to them, obviously, to the extent where if someone really, really screwed the pooch, you could have a damnatio memoriae against them.
Yeah. Well, that's so interesting too, because it's like memory was so important to them, but they also recognized how easy it is to manipulate memory, you know, and like we're
Yes.
very happy to kind of use that as needed.
Yeah, well, I think
Yeah,
the
definitely.
exact term is something that we've made up, isn't it, Dr. G? The whole idea of damnatio memoriae isn't something. It's not like the Romans would come out and say, "I issue a damnatio memoriae against you," but it is that idea of this is what we choose to remember, and this is what we choose to forget, and that is what I think we have in common with the Romans in terms of why we build certain things, why we pull certain things down, why we move them, why we change them. So that is something I see as being something that connects us, I guess.
And I think this sort of feeds into some of the things that have happened in the last decade where people have discussed, should statues that commemorate things that no longer feel like they're part of our identity, should they be removed? Or should they be replaced with something that better reflects our understanding of ourselves now rather than the previous centuries that have gone before? And I think that's really interesting because I think of something like the Arc de Triomphe, which is probably the most famous of the arches that exist in the modern world outside of Rome. And it's a very modern structure. And it has an eternal flame that is maintained, which I think is really quite interesting. But that I'll save those ideas for some other time.
Are you
But
thinking of the Vestal Virgins? Are you?
I was gonna say, I was like, well, I know where you're going with this.
I wouldn't want to mention them right now. But imagine if the state of the city of Paris or the municipality, whoever's in charge in that local area, decided that arch needed to be changed. Now that would be a very interesting experience, I think, from a public memory standpoint at this point. And I think it would generate a lot of controversy, just given within the context of where it sits, but also people's idea about what it represents. And for something like in Rome, where Caracalla says, get her off that structure, I don't want him on that arch anymore. That top-down approach of deciding what gets to be remembered and what doesn't get to be remembered would function differently today, but we still see those conversations happening, and we certainly see people proactively removing statues, which I would say sort of fill a similar criteria to arches. And then discussions about, well, should we erect an arch and what would that arch represent? And a lot of them in the early 20th century were connected with the fallen soldiers in wars. So that's something where we see a military connection, a nationalistic connection, and a way of commemorating at the same time. And those sorts of ideas are probably very in line with Roman ideas about what is appropriate for commemoration, and is an interesting sort of side effect, I think, of like, what does the modern state represent and what does it try to inculcate its population with? And then I think about Romans in Rome at the time where these things were happening for them. And did everybody buy the rhetoric? And I'm guessing that not everybody did.
And you're right, Liv, in terms of the propaganda, because obviously Augustus recognized how propagandistic these things could be, because he basically puts a monopoly on triumphs for the imperial family as soon as he possibly can. So he recognizes the power of that spectacle.
Yeah.
I think it's even beyond that, though, because Augustus kind of tries to shut down the triumph completely. So
What did I say?
We have this
toxic masculinity ruining the party again.
So,
and what a party.
You were saying he sort of co-opts it for the imperial family, but it's kind of even worse than that in a way, or maybe better than that, because he seems to want it to disappear entirely. He wants it gone.
That's true. Yeah.
And it seems like, from his perspective, and obviously we can't be sure, but we're trying to guess based on the fact that the Senate keeps offering triumphs to Augustus and his relatives, and Augustus keeps shutting it down, only up until the point where it seems like he can't say no anymore. So Tiberius does get to celebrate a triumph very late in the piece. And
that's true.
It seems like it's a capitulation on Augustus's part to the Senate, but he really doesn't seem to want them to happen because he consistently refuses for himself. So he gets out of the civil war period, conquering Egypt. He gets out of that period and he does celebrate some triumphs, but then there's the point from when he is given the honorific name of Augustus where he really tries to not have triumphs anymore. And it seems like it's not a triumph for him, it's not a triumph for anybody. And
I see that
because there's been this but because there's been this sort of hyper competition in the late Republic, through that first century, with Pompey and Caesar and everybody trying their best, trying to outcompete each other from a military perspective and winning these honors, and it becomes an egotistical display of what they're capable of rather than something that's maybe giving back into the Roman system. It seems like Augustus is like, if we keep doing this, we're going to keep having the same problem crop up. And
Yes.
this means that we don't see a lot of triumphs now.
Well, we even see that come through in some of the sources. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think in Dionysius, he actually kind of says, yeah, I think Dionysius actually kind of says that triumphs used to be great, but now they're just, they've lost the true heart, the true spirit that they were initially meant to embody. It's all just extravagance and arrogance, etc.
Hmm. And so we do get one triumph in 19 that's not somebody from the imperial family. So there is that.
Yes.
But apart from
Doesn't
that,
Augustus make sure
not
that the list has no space for anyone after that? He's like, that's it. The list has no more
that's
room.
it. I've made a whole roll and list of all the triumphs, and you look, the tablet's full. How can I
Yeah.
tell you?
You can't get another one.
That's so
These things aren't a dime a dozen.
like this is so interesting, and I'm glad you guys like looped it around to Augustus, because I was gonna ask if there's like a marked difference, between the triumphs, and it sounds like
Oh,
absolutely
massively.
yes. But my guess,
Yeah.
like, my guess was going to be that they became more propagandistic, because that's just like what I associate Augustus with. Out of my, I have minimal Roman knowledge. So yeah, I was like, so it's interesting to hear that he kind of did the opposite. I don't know.
Mm.
Well, Augustus
What do
did,
you
but
think about
I
this?
don't think you could say that other emperors felt the same way that he did.
Right.
Yeah. Like he tries to shut it down.
That's what I mean when I say I think it's part of Augustus' shadiness. Yeah. I think it's Augustus'
But
thing where he's like, oh, I restored the Republic, guys. And I think it is his way, as you say, of dealing with a problem, but also maybe not calling attention to his position within the system too much, perhaps.
I'd also like to flag that maybe Tiberius is an issue here, because the two triumphs that really happen under Augustus, once he's cemented his power, are Tiberius. And
Yeah, that's
given that Augustus seems pretty anti-triumph, but Tiberius gets a couple,
maybe he's just a good general, unlike some.
I wonder if Tiberius was like, I think Tiberius might be more Republican than Augustus is at this point. I think Augustus is being
He is.
pretty pragmatic in his principate and his way of doing things. And Tiberius is
Yeah.
like, well, I've won all of these battles for you. I've done all of the things. I deserve this recognition. And I wonder if there's a tension between the two of them, because Tiberius gets one in 7 BC and then he gets one again in 12 CE. So, but
he's awesome.
that's
What can
it.
I
It's
say?
not Augustus. Sorry?
I said he's awesome. What can I say?
I was going to say, it's the pro-Tiberian
He's
coming
actually got
through again.
talent on the battlefield. He doesn't get sick every time the swords come out.
Rude! It's just an
These
earache. I
men.
just need to lie down. Leave the man alone.
I'll back off.
Augustus is a
Look, I
fragile
thought
human.
one thing I thought that would also be interesting to say when we're thinking about memory and how triumphs and triumphal arches sort of connect to our modern times is it's probably worth noting as well how the modern landscape of Rome in particular was shaped by people like Mussolini. Obviously, part of Mussolini's concept for fascism, and not just his, but he's obviously just the most obvious person to sort of link it to, is connected to Rome itself as part of what he was trying to forge as like the modern national identity, and that monumental architecture, the glory, the power of Rome, as perhaps popularly understood, particularly in this time period, the military aspect, the discipline aspect that supposedly made Rome great, is appealing to people who are in a modern military / authoritarian position for those sorts of reasons. And the architecture that goes along with it is a part of that language. And so, although he didn't get to complete it, Mussolini was trying to shape the modern city of Rome and sort of get rid of stuff that he thought was cluttering the city. And he wanted to really draw attention to certain monuments from Rome's past as a way of celebrating that part of Italian identity and bringing those values back to try and shape modern Italy and what he hoped obviously would be a glorious century ahead for them. And so the way that we understand them and the way that we see these things are very much shaped by the fascist period in Rome, as indeed a lot of Rome is, not just the ancient Roman monuments.
Yeah. Well, and completely unrelated, the US has put out that directive that like all government building from now on needs to be like in a classical style. That's like an exaggeration slightly, not even, it's just like hyperbolic way of describing it, but like yeah, because there is just something about that militaristic glory of Rome that that certain types of leaders really like to latch onto.
And it's been continually reinforced, particularly through European countries and places where Europeans have colonized. They've gone in and been like, let's put a thing here.
You mean like the Prince's Gate in downtown Toronto was not built by the indigenous people of this land?
It was not. And I'll give you another one that made me laugh out loud, which I didn't know about, which is from Australia, which is an Arch of Victory from a place called Ballarat in Victoria. And not only is it a funky little arch, but it is part of an avenue of many, many trees, 3,000, nearly 4,000 trees lining 22 kilometers of road. And each of these trees has a name attached to it for a fallen soldier. And then there's this arch that marks the start of this avenue. It is a fallen soldier, nationalistic, commemorative structure. And I haven't seen it myself, but 22 kilometers worth of trees. And I'm like, wow. As well as this arch, which is, I think, made of concrete. And yeah, because I was starting to look into like where have the modern arches popped up, and they're all over the place. And it wouldn't be the first time that the United States has decided that they really like classical or neoclassical architecture. I mean, they've already got a lot of examples that they can leverage off. And so it is maybe unsurprising in a time of rising authoritarianism that the appeal of this architecture is re-emerging, because it is so historically associated with imperial rule of various kinds, whether we're talking about Roman Empire, Mussolini's attempt to create a new Italian empire, the way that stretches into German nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries with things like the Brandenburg Gate, which was built before then, but still leveraged. And all of those little moments in history where people have gone back to this style of architecture and said, this is what represents us on a fundamental level. And this idea of a continuing unbroken attachment to the ideas of Greece, where Rome borrows a lot of these ideas about the architecture from originally anyway, into Roman style architecture, which takes it in a slightly different direction to the neoclassical. And maybe we're going into a new phase of that again.
Yeah, and America in particular has a tormented relationship with Rome because, of course, the way America likes to conceive of itself, it's got a little bit of the same thing that Rome has going on, where it's like, oh, we're simple rural farmers, but wait, we really like to conquer other people and take their wealth and make our lives really opulent. Whilst they've got that sort of tension going on for themselves, America does too, in that America obviously also has this moment where it turns against kingship and supposedly starts on a new path and doesn't want to conceive of itself like an empire, like the European empires, whilst exerting gigantic global influence. And obviously it borrows some of its ideas from its understanding of Rome at various points in time. So it always has this kind of tension of, ooh, we admire these things from Rome, but also can't be Rome because it's an empire and that empire fell and we don't want to fall. It's just that constant, it's that balancing act that has to be done in terms of America's relationship with Rome, where it's like, we love it, but we also have to hate it, but we love these certain aspects. Whereas for people who were 20th century leaders like, say, Mussolini and Hitler, I don't think they had to apologize at all for their love of Rome. They liked the military, they liked the militaristic aspect, they liked the imperialist aspect. Those monuments, I think, that they borrowed from were partly supposed to embody the kinds of things that they admired about Rome, of its enduring capacity. And the fact that these monuments are still standing, it kind of embodies what both Mussolini and Hitler were setting out to establish, thankfully unsuccessfully. But they were trying to establish these really enduring epochs for their modern countries. And when you look at Rome, even though, yes, Rome fell, it still endured for 1,000 years. Its monuments are still standing. The power and authority that it had over the world, fairly unrivaled. Not completely unrivaled, but fairly unrivaled. And so it's those sorts of things, those sorts of ideas that they therefore want to incorporate, but they do it in different ways. Mussolini and Hitler don't have the same exact architectural language. And yeah, they do it in different ways, but certainly they both are interested in reshaping their cities in a way that's going to also allow for military parades. And I believe that Mussolini was actually trying to construct a sort of modern triumphal route. I don't think he quite managed to accomplish what it was he wanted to, but certainly if you go and see the remnants of these regimes, what you will mostly find is, oh yeah, this massive space was meant to be for amassing the soldiers, and then they were going to parade, and then they were going to end up in this particular space which had significant meaning. And so, yeah, you can kind of see again that they are slightly borrowing ideas from Rome in the way that they're incorporating it into their militaristic ideas, because that's what their regimes are about, and it is about power and authority and display. But then, of course, when you start to get into the nitty-gritty of what the Roman triumph was about, that's where you start to see massive divergence.
Mm-hmm. Oh, both of you have just put this in. You've said it all beautifully, and now I'm already feeling like I'm going to mess it all up by trying to phrase anything now. But it's so interesting. It's so like, I mean, it's one of these topics, like we've talked about this for like, I don't know, like a month and a half or so. And now it's just become more and more like, oh my God, what are we talking about? What are we looking at? And it's just interesting to looking back at the ways that the authoritarian regimes of Hitler and Mussolini did use that architecture, like you were saying they used it differently, and it's just so interesting now to see it coming back in the States, the use of neoclassical architecture, because obviously we are now living in like a post Mussolini and Hitler period, right? So it's like, well, we all have the kind of knowledge of how that architecture can be, a dog whistle or various things like that. And it's just sort of, I don't know. I guess I'm just noting that little check mark has been, checked since those things, is that now we all know what they mean when you want to pull back this like just claw back the ancient world, but the pristine white marble of the ancient world that didn't actually exist. It's notable, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, exactly. And nor would the monuments have looked the way that it all does now. That we have to remember, even something like the Attributions was, I think, massively restored in the 19th century. You have to remember that what you see now of Rome is not what the Romans would have experienced. What we see is what survived. All the brick, mud, wood buildings, they're all gone. The chaos, the dirt, the color of Rome, the smell, that's all gone. And so what's left behind, I think, is a sanitized version of what Rome was, and it therefore can be looked at certain people and go, oh, how admirable, but they're forgetting about all the other stuff. I mean, Rome would have been, I think, actually a higgledy-piggledy mess of various buildings, some of which, are beautiful. But what were they amongst? What were they hidden amongst? How did you have to get there? I mean, I don't think it's quite as clean as it appreciates. And that's what I mean when I say Mussolini has somewhat shaped the way that we also appreciate these buildings that have managed to survive. But I also agree with you. Like, I love Rome. Dr. G loves Rome, but it's because it's interesting. If people love Rome for different reasons, like swallowing the hype that the Romans put out about themselves and are copying the way that they think the Romans used to do things because they also want to embody some of the less admirable qualities of Rome, you should be thinking about who those people really are and what they actually stand for.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
follow up on that as well, there are various things to keep in mind, and I think one of them is that people have written about this in the modern period in the wake of the rise of fascism and Nazism. And it is worth everybody's while, I think, to go back to something like Umberto Eco's um, book Eternal Fascism, where he lays out the sorts of things that you can expect to see as signs that fascism is on the rise. And one of them is this cult of tradition. One of them is the rejection of the modern. And so to have anybody come out and say, I want to do this in a sort of neoclassical, I want to replicate the ancients, it might on the surface feel like it's coming from a place of just like sort of architectural interest, but you have to look more broadly, and that what else might be going on that suggests that this could be something different. And this is where we've got some clear pointers about what we might think about. And so it's not a problem, for instance, on the surface of things to be like, oh, ancient temples, they're really cool. I personally think the architecture of them is really amazing. Should they be replicated in a modern world? That would really depend on the motivation and who's building it and what's going on. I think it would be a very different thing for me to say, you know what, I've got a little plot of land, I'm going to build a house that's got some columns, it'll be cute. For the state to come and say, all buildings now must be purpose built to resemble the ancient world and those sort of ideals that are sort of embedded in that, because the Romans were terrible on so many levels. I mean,
my gosh.
just if we're thinking about the Triumph is predicated on expansionistic militarism, and it is a celebration, an ongoing celebration, because it's happening for thousands of years, of that military conquest. So the military industrial complex is right at the heart of what Rome is doing. And to what extent would it be useful to replicate that? And obviously, for modern empires who like to pretend that they don't own the territory for which they have conquered in other ways, or own through sort of soft means rather than the physical means, these sorts of things are really dangerous. So I would keep that in mind. And do some reading.
Thank you for
Yeah.
having such a educational and like straightforward piece for this too, because I think it's so important, and I'm also just like feel so incapable right now. So thank you for having that said, because
It is important
yeah.
to talk about, because this is something that the monument that sort of sparked this discussion that may or may not actually go ahead. It's going to be erected, obviously, in not just any space. It's, from my understanding, it's incredibly difficult to get a new structure of any kind in this particular space, because it's obviously got national significance. It's where a lot of really important museums and memorials, etc., are. And so to have something new put there is a big deal. And what that monument is, I think, therefore, is important. It's obviously sending a message of some kind. And yeah, I think if it's going to have figures of winged victory and eagles, which, okay, yeah, there are eagles in America. I know, but let's think about why America also initially turned towards the eagle, because they're a predatory animal and they embody power and strength, and they did for the Romans as well. I mean, you just have to think about that language. Like Dr. G and I love the Romans because we think that their propaganda is hilarious. We think their understanding of themselves is hilarious, and they're easy to laugh at. We don't look at the Romans and go, wow, I want what he's having. we don't want to emulate what Rome stood for. It's not that all their ideas are bad, but certainly I think at a lot of their core understandings of how things work are certainly not things that we really want to see come back in real life. They're interesting to study, but they're not things that you necessarily want to come back. And as Dr. G said, motivation is key. I've certainly seen artwork of temples, which is like colorful, and it is meant to be an artwork and something that people appreciate for purely the aesthetic value. But if you do have a regime putting out particular monuments, which are obviously, I would say, trying to connect with the examples that have gone before for the same reason that people who erected things that, the 20th century and 21st century did it. You just have to question, who are you associating with, and is this actually sending you a very clear signal about what they believe in and who they really are, and are those values actually things that you want to associate with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to just remind my listeners of the episode that will have come out just maybe a week ago by the time this one drops, about the new book White Pedestal, by Curtis Dozier, all about white supremacists using the classical world because it's relevant. It keeps being relevant. And that's a large part of why what the episode that this was originally meant to accompany, and then is just tacking on a few weeks later. But yeah, I think it's very important to be looking at this stuff and talking about it with people who recognize everything, but specifically, just to connect back to what you were saying, I mean, this is why you guys are my Roman people, because the Roman Empire is like a litmus test of humans. It's like, why do you like the Roman, or like, I say empire, but I just mean Rome, but like, why do you like ancient Rome? And it's like, the answer that someone gives you is a really important answer. And so I love having you two who can come on and explain wacky things that the Romans did, and about their wacky propaganda, because I think that is what's interesting, and that's certainly the way we should be viewing them, is with very critical.
Oh yeah, they take themselves way too seriously.
This kind of sounds like another country I know.
Yeah, they don't have a great sense of humor about themselves.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly it. I think that's the thing about all these monuments. Yeah, the monuments are examples of how Rome took itself way too seriously.
Although, as a postscript to that, in the triumph itself, the Romans did encourage the soldiers to sing ribald songs about the guy who was celebrating the triumph.
True.
So one of the things they did do, they did have a good time in that procession amongst themselves, because they got to sing rude songs at the general and make up stuff, and they wouldn't get into trouble. So they were having a great time.
Well,
yeah, it was a time to insult the commander.
Speaking of singing rude songs, another thing the Romans would have had that I think maybe, the classics obsessed losers over in the White House maybe need to take a look at this element, which is that the Romans would have had a hell of a lot more dicks. And so I just think that if the US government is going to, take itself really just as seriously as the Romans, they have to put a lot more like enormous phalluses into everything.
Yeah. Well, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Like, I think it's great to study the classics. Obviously, this is where Greece, Rome, doesn't matter. Like, I think studying the classics is fantastic. I think studying history is really important, because you get into these debates and you truly understand things. But the problem is when people who aren't very critical and who accept things on a superficial level, or who just actually want to buy into the propaganda. They don't want to dig beneath the surface and go, oh, wow, I guess Rome wasn't always this mighty empire. And they actually, for a long time, exaggerated how grand their battles and military conquests were, because they wanted to have an exaggerated sense of their own importance and their own destiny, et cetera, et cetera. It's people who either don't want to dig beneath the surface or don't dig beneath the surface. That becomes a problem. And it's also a problem when they want to harness something that they see as being useful and able to be weaponized as propaganda from the past. It doesn't matter what you're studying, actually. If anybody does that with any period of history, Rome is just one that's a popular one to go back to, because it's obviously had such a legacy in so many civilizations. But it doesn't matter what period of history you're studying. If someone is weaponizing an aspect of the past in order to achieve something in the present, that's a problem. You should be questioning it. And that's not how I like to do classics. I do it because it's interesting. I do it because I like the stories. And I do it because I like to understand the world that I live in. I don't want to do it because of the propaganda aspect of it, or because I want to exercise power in a certain way. And I mean, like, I've toyed with the idea sometimes, because obviously Rome is such a big part of my life, of getting a tattoo or something that reflects Rome, because Rome is such a big part of my life. But I never will, because I think that the message that that would send is hugely problematic, because I don't want to be mistaken for somebody who is, is one of those right-wing classics people who has like SPQR on their arm because they think the Romans are freaking fantastic or whatever. It'd be more because
danger.
the Romans are just a big part of my life. It's not because it's not because I'm like, militaristic values.
Yeah. I mean, I do think you could get a really silly Rome tattoo and not have that problem. I'm just saying I don't know why this is my example, because maybe I'm saying that Lord of the Rings is my Rome. But
Nice.
I do have a tattoo, like one of those classic like hearts with a banner over it. I have one of those that says Aragorn on my ass, just because I think it's funny. And I don't know, I think maybe you could use something like that, like Augustus. It wouldn't be for you, Dr. Ron, but maybe Dr. needs to get Augustus. It's just something that came to me.
We know
that one's not for you. That one's not for you. But like something like that,
Ladies, new tattoo idea. Let's get matching Augustus tattoos.
I think maybe you get the Augustus heart tattoo and I get the broken heart with Augustus's name on it. That would be more emblematic of our relationship.
Wow. But you know what? That is still a win for me, because that means you would have tattooed Augustus on yourself and not Tiberius. And my heart.
You know what? You're joking about this, Liv, but I'm thinking that maybe for Dr. G's birthday, I'm going to just take her to a tattoo shop and be like, we're getting matching Roman tattoos. Ones that can't be mistaken for us being white supremacists. Woo!
To be clear, I'm not joking. You can get weird shit. It's so fun. I just
maybe we should get Romulus
recommend
and Remus.
Tattoos. Yeah, you can be. You
could like have it each. You could just cut the she-wolf in half and you each get like a suckling baby. And then you could have them on your arms so that when you stand next to each other, it's like
that's a great
your
idea.
arms match up. Yeah. Like best friend tattoos, but Remus and Romulus.
I like this. This has been very useful. I'm writing these ideas down. Yeah.
I'm really glad. I expect to see photo evidence as soon as possible. And I think that is a perfect way to wrap up this episode, because we got laughing at the end, and that's what's important.
Look, in these dark times, one has to laugh.
Exactly. So thank you guys so much for doing this. I do really appreciate it, especially since I was just like, I don't know, everything's wild. Can we talk about triumphs and arches or something? So thank you for
we totally can. We can.
I don't know what we want to talk about.
No, you did
thank you
amazing work. So thank you. I appreciate it. Well, I mean, I'm obviously going to tell the listeners in a separate intro, outro, whatever, all about you guys as usual. But is there anything specific you want to share with anyone about reading or learning more? You have your books and obviously your podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. G, you want to do the promo?
If you want to check out The Partial Historians, we are a podcast available wherever you listen to good podcasts. We have also written 2 books, one on the Kings of Rome called Rex, the 7 Kings of Rome, and another book called Your Cheeky Guide to the Roman Empire, which is packed full of all of the salacious stories that Romans do not want you to know. And recently, if you happen to be in the US, you might also be able to catch us on the National Geographic documentary called Gladiators, Warriors of the Ancient World, where we talk about all things to do with the arena and what's really going on there.
Another problematic example of Roman militarism. That also has a sacred aspect. They love combining religion and their awfulness.
And you have violence. They do love that.
Yeah.
Do not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Violence, religion, military conquest. It's always there.
These guys don't know how to have a good time. It's always about killing somebody.
Well, nerds, thank you as always for listening. I'm going to keep trying to bring things that are both fun and relevant, and I'm not going to try to do it all the time, so don't worry. We're going to focus on some fun. It will always have elements of this, because that's just where the nature of, the patriarchal Western imperialist violence structure, that all comes from. But, we're going to try to do both during this time. And I think the most important thing is to just be coming together as people who care about other people, because to me that's all that matters right now, and that is the biggest hurdle somehow to some kind of sense of peace, is just this notion of caring about others. So remember, love your neighbors, build a community, protect your neighbors, especially if they aren't white, and if you are. And we'll get through all of this together. I love you all. Let's use the world of ancient Greece and its mythology to tear down the patriarchal Western imperialist structure. Okay? Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Penguish is the Hermes to my Olympians, and we'll be back very soon with more of her historical content as I wrap up my kids' odyssey. Select music is by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the Memory Collective podcast network, which will be coming together with more very soon, but for now, which includes the Partial Historians. So for more Roman history and a nice dose of Australian feminism, check out the Partial Historians. You can find a link in this episode's description. Thank you all so damn much. I am Liv, and I love this shit. And you should know that my adorable cat Squid is supervising over this right now. She's very appreciative. Oh, and there's a Greek cat stepping on my keyboard. Okay.